Warrior, build me an army worthy of Mordor.
Na 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 na.
Swamp Rat. Miniatures.
Ooh, hello my friends, hope you are well. Recently a good friend of mine asked if I could paint up his Isengard Battlehost box, which is a fun little starter army in the world of Middle-earth strategy battle games, and I thought I will do you one better than that, my boy. I will paint up this whole thing, but also do it in a ridiculous and basically pointless self-imposed time limit of 24 hours. There's no real reason for me to attempt this in such a relatively short time span, but some of my favourite miniature painting videos have been the big 24-hour painting marathon challenges by other creators, and I just wanted to try it for myself to see if I could even maintain my concentration long enough to come close to a finished army. And not to spoil anything, but I was pretty happy with what I accomplished in this time limit. So
10 AM, Thursday 25th January. Let's do it.
So it begins.
Now this box has sort of 3.5 character models, being the Grimmer Worm-tongue one, Saruman on foot and mounted, and this funky little Palantir. I thought it'd be best to start off the painting with these characters as they'd require a bit more effort and concentration to get looking good, and the thought of putting in said effort and concentration towards the end of this 24-hour painting slog felt more unappealing to me than me unappealing this Satsuma. So I started my first hour with something easy, being the black colours on Saruman's horse and Grimmer's cape, and I'd sprayed all of our miniatures with black paint after priming since there were so many dark colours between them, which meant I could save some time and go straight to layering up some little highlights on these puppies. I basically just used some Eshin grey to add an initial bit of brightness, mixed in with some Fenrisian grey to push that further, and then ended with Fenrisian grey on its own for a kind of bluey grey highlight, which I think looks quite nice over black. I picked out some of the hairs on the horse's mane with some Dawnstone to help them pop a bit, and with those done I had more or less used up my first hour of painting time, but I was now feeling warmed up and ready for the long road ahead of me. In hour 2 I worked on the reins and the saddle of the horse, which was really quick and easy, just starting darker then adding some highlights for a bit of pizzazz, and also Grimmer's robe and shawl. For this I started with a darker brown colour of Dryad bark and then used some XV88, which is a kind of desert yellow colour, to start stippling on some very rough highlights. I sloshed on some Agrak Surfshade to help them blend in a bit better, and then reaffirmed the highlights with the XV88 and also some Towlight Ochre, which ended up looking a bit different to the box art, but pretty good in my books. I started off my next section of painting with 21 hours and 50 minutes left on the clock, and it was now time to work on the creamy robe for both the Saruman models. I literally hate painting creams and whites because I just find them really difficult to get looking good without either looking really messy or just having no sense of volume to them. And this time was no exception to that either, you know. You've seen a few little snippets of the process, but I was doing a ton of back and forth here to try and make this look okay. For some reason I decided to use Agrak Surfshade over the initial base colour and then highlight upward to the final creamy colour, but this was definitely a mistake in hindsight. I should have just started the highlights straight onto the darker base coat and it might have ended up looking a bit cleaner. But hey ho, lessons learned for the next time I'm creaming up a wizard. Grimmer's little snot rag got the same treatment as Saruman's robes, and by the time I'd finished laying down all this cream, it'd pretty much been another 2 hours and I was left with just over 19 remaining. Also, just as a quick side note, you'll see the timer on the iPad quite sporadically throughout this video because I was also watching shows on it in the background while I painted, but I did make sure to record all my times as I finish off the sections, and they have been confirmed and authenticated by the FPI. At this point I had a quick bite to eat as I needed some nutrients to fuel my painting further, and after stretching out a bit to make sure I wouldn't turn into a little prawn painting hybrid, I was ready for more action. It was well into my 6th hour when I picked the brush back up, and it was now time for me to paint in the pasty flesh of our little miscreants. In the interest of time efficiency, I was using another quite simple paint scheme for this step, which comprised of a base of Bugman's Glow, a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade, a layer of Cadian Flesh Tone, and a final highlight of Kislev Flesh. Saruman's got some pretty hefty eyebrows on him, so I made sure to paint these in as well, and then entered the final stages for these character miniatures with just over 18 hours remaining. The last things I needed to paint on the Super Saruman brothers were the grey/white elements, being his luscious flowing hair and beard much like my own, the small trim piece on his robe and the dangly bits hanging off it, and then also his slippers, which I find kind of funny. I don't know why, I just feel like he should have some more menacing shoes than these little soft looking slippers, but anyway. For the last step, I painted in the orbs on top of his staff, just starting with a kind of pale grey colour and then layering up to a brighter white, you know, nothing fancy, just getting the job done. And with that, our 3 main character models were now completed with 16 hours and 46 minutes left on the clock, which meant a total of 7¼ hours to paint them up, which really isn't too bad all things considered. They're not perfect, and the cream robes especially could do with about 400 hours more work to undo what I've subjected them to, but as a whole, I'm relatively happy with them. I'm saving the Palantir until the end just so I have something different, but still kind of easy to look forward to after all the batch painting I'm about to do. And after another short break to move around a bit and inject a Muller rice into my digestive system, it was now the time I had actually been quite looking forward to. Time to run a train on these sweet Uruk-hai butts. A painting train, I mean. Not, yeah. So before I go straight into the batch paints and chaos, I thought it'd be worth running through the paint scheme I'll be using for these loyal servants of Saruman. The box comes with a mixture of the Uruk-hai scouts we see at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, with 24 of these bad boys in total, some equipped with bows and the others with swords, and then 20 of the Uruk-hai warriors we see in the 2 towers at the Battle of Helm's Deep, with some wielding pikes and the others again armed with swords and shields. Of course, in the interest of time efficiency and keeping the process as simple as possible, I decided on the following scheme to pump these guys out on a conveyor belt style. I start by dry brushing Iron Warriors metallic on for all the metal items like the armor and the weaponry, Rhinox hide for the flesh, and also for the areas of darker yellow, which helps to save a bit more time and brain power from less back and forth, and works well because the areas will still look quite different after highlighting. The Uruk-hai scouts also have some different leather than the warriors, so I use some Mournfang brown for these areas, and then retouching any little belts and straps using the Rhinox hide. The woodwork for the bows and the pikes gets touched in with some dried bark, the gloves get left black, and then I wash the entire models in Agrak Surfshade to darken down the armor and add some volume to the other areas. Then for the highlights, I use Doomball Brown for the first layer of skin and Tuskor Fur for a second layer to give it a nice kind of burgundy look in the lightest areas, a mixture of Gorthor Brown and Rhinox Hide to highlight the dark leathers, some Scrag Brown to highlight the lighter leathers, and a mixture of Gorthor Brown and dried bark for the wood. The black gloves get a highlight with Dawnstone, and then to finish the miniatures off, I just use some Shining Silver to highlight the armor and the weaponry by just running it down some of the edges and adding a few little dots here and there. And that's it. That's the scheme for painting up our Uruk-hai. It's probably not going to win you any awards, but for armies like this, I think the most important thing is to have a nice synchronized force that looks good when they're all together, as opposed to having all the individual minis painted to a show-stopping standard, which would just take an insane amount of time to do. I did end up painting on little T for some of the Uruk-hai after I finished everything off, just as a little kind of extra touch, but I didn't really include this in the main bulk of the painting because it felt like an optional step since it's barely visible at the scale and only took about 10 minutes to do anyway. And mainly because I completely forgot about it until right at the end. Anyway, let's see how long it took to paint all these guys. So after my break, I had about 15 hours and 40 minutes to go, and I got to work with the metallic paint first. This step was actually really easy because I didn't need to be very precise here. I was just flapping my brush back and forth in a kind of wild painting frenzy, applying the Iron Warriors paint like there was no tomorrow. In the end, this took me only about half an hour to do, which led me into my 10th hour of painting, feeling pretty motivated overall. The Rhinox hide flesh and dark leather base coat was up next, and again, this one felt pretty easy. I was getting into quite a good flow of the batch painting at this point, as it'd been quite a while since I'd done any batch painting, and I've never done this many miniatures at the same time, so I was actually really enjoying myself here. It felt quite nice seeing the colours going on and the miniatures starting to come to life without having to spend ages trying to blend colours or perfect tiny little details like I might do with individual or small groups of miniatures. The painting on this project was just, here's your miniature, here's your recipe, take your colour and whack it on where it needs to be, which felt really refreshing compared to the minutiae that can happen when you're trying to make 1 or 2 miniatures perfect. So yeah, I was having a good time, even though I ended up having to give the Mournfang Brown 2 coats to cover up the black undercoat, which took longer than I expected. The Agrak Surfshade washing stage was another quick and easy step like the metallics, because there was no need for precision here at all. It was just, you get a wash, you get a wash, the back of my ears wish they'd get a wash, but then where would I grow my potatoes? And this step took less than half an hour to thoroughly soak the Uruk-hai horde. I left the miniatures for a while to make sure the wash had enough time to dry properly, and since the energy from my Muller rice was now like a fart in the wind, gone, I sat down for a very late dinner. The break lasted a bit longer than I anticipated. I think once I took a step back from the miniatures, I realised I was actually getting pretty tired at this point. And motivation was starting to wane just a tiny bit, but I managed to get on both the layers of the skin highlight in just under an hour and a half, which felt like a decent achievement at the time. I moved on to the highlights for all the leather items and the wooden pieces next, and this took over an hour and a half to complete, which was a fair bit longer than I was expecting. And I was really starting to flag at this point. Minusing out the breaks I'd taken for food and stuff, I've probably been painting for something like 14 hours by now, which is by far the most painting I've ever done in one sitting, and I would be lying if I said I was having fun at this point. It was definitely starting to feel like more of a chore, but yeah. I was able to pull my socks up high and soldier on because I'd reached the penultimate stage of my Uruk-hai batch painting scheme, giving a quick highlight to the black gloves, and this stage was by far the least enjoyable part of the whole process. I don't know, just felt really annoying and fiddly at this point, so I was glad that it didn't take too long. By the time I reached the metallic highlight portion, the final step for our Legion of Uruk-hai, my eyes felt like they were bleeding and my hand felt like it was turning into a lobster claw because it was cramping up so much. But the end was in sight. I could almost taste it, and it tasted like burps containing a hint of Muller rice and paint water from the tip of my brush. It was glorious. So with the last glints of shining silver going onto this happy little Uruk here, I had finished my batch painting portion. I was victorious. I felt like Boromir at the end of Fellowship of the Ring if he had bothered to use his shield. Undefeatable, a true warrior. And now, only one more foe stood ahead of me. So, for the Palantir, I didn't really have a paint scheme in mind, and because I was so tired, I just started painting and thought I'd see what happened. I first dry brushed some reds and oranges on top to get a really rough glowing effect going on around the ball, and when that looked reasonably okay, I then moved on to the big ball itself. For this, I basically just went back and forth with some oranges and yellows, and I wasn't really keeping track of what I was doing here. My notes for this section basically just said, you painted it, work it out, which wasn't massively helpful. But yeah, I basically just tried to make a kind of yellowy orange eye shape on two of the sides, glazed some black around the sides to make it look a bit closer to the film version, and then gave it a little reptilian pupil slit down the middle. I painted black over some of the glow I'd done earlier to make it look like it was just coming out from the sides with the eye painted on, and then to finish it all off, I added some really quick edge highlights to all the spiky black portions using some Thousand Suns blue and some Fenrisian grey, which seemed to work okay. With that done, I had 4 hours and 47 minutes left on my countdown, and I was literally exhausted by this point. When I was a teenager, I used to be able to stay up all night easily, but now it's more like,
I'm old, Gandalf.
And I basically couldn't stay up any longer, so I decided to call it a night. When I woke up the next day, I got to work on the bases, and I decided to keep these quite simple, so I basically just applied some of my homemade mud mixture around their feet, then left that to dry, and I wasn't really keeping track of the time formally at this point because I usually leave this mud to dry for like a half a day at least, and that would have taken me way past my time limit when I wasn't actively doing any painting or anything like that, so it doesn't count, okay? It doesn't! But once it dried, I gave the mud a quick dry brushing to bring out the texture, and then added a few tufts and bits of flock here and there for a bit more flavour. The rims got done in Steel Legion Drab, and then I also spent another half an hour or so doing the touch-ups that I'd missed in my exhausted painting stupor from the night before, like dotting in a few tiny teeth and some little eyeballs on these Uruk-hai archers. And that is our whole army finished now. Woo! Let's see how they're looking. So excluding the drying time with the mud, I probably used up another 2.5 hours for applying the actual mud and the tufts themselves to the basing, and that's a fairly exaggerated time estimate. I think it was actually a decent bit less than that, but just to be safe, I'm estimating upwards, meaning we've got 20 hours and 13 minutes to finish the main bulk of the painting, 2.5 hours or so for the basing, and another 30 minutes for touch-ups, giving us a grand total of approximately 23 hours and 13 minutes to paint and base this entire army, which is pretty insane. A project like this would usually take me like a week minimum of painting every night after work, so to have it finished within such a short time frame feels pretty ridiculous to me, even though it was a bit of a slog to get through towards the end especially. So can I say I painted an entire army in 24 hours? I mean, technically I painted it in less than 24 hours working time when I exclude the drying time for the bases, but realistically I did have to go for a sleep, and the drying time of the bases would put it at more of a 36 or 40 hour time frame. I don't know. If we're talking purely model painting time, then I did do that in just over 20 hours, or closer to 21 when you factor in my touch-up time. That sounded naughty. But I think I'm going to take it as a win either way. You know, 20 to 21 hours to paint the actual models seems like a pretty solid effort. But would I recommend doing this? I probably wouldn't, to be honest. There's not really any point of doing so unless you're going to a tournament the next day and you have a whole unpainted army sitting in front of you, but at that point you should really just take a look at your time management skills instead, because there's probably a larger issue going on there. And you know, spacing it out over a week or two is going to be way more realistic and probably make it a more enjoyable, slow-paced process overall. Would I do it again though? Maybe. It was actually pretty fun for me to do. Even though it was getting tough at the end as I was getting more tired, I'd been quite excited to try this out, and I had fun eating a load of snacks and catching up on shows I'd been meaning to watch in the background. But it's weird, it's kind of weird how life goes, you know. I used to be a bit younger and staying up all night with my friends, you know, like drinking and having a good time, you know, partying, woo! But now I stay up all night and paint little plastic men from Lord of the Rings. Oh well, I love it. Anyway, as always, if you enjoyed this video, then please make sure to subscribe or leave a like or a comment. Let me know if you'll be attempting anything like this anytime soon, or if you'll just continue to paint your miniatures like a normal person. And for now, I have been your friendly neighborhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.
Whom do you serve?
Saruman.